We have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind.
Yeah.
We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery.
In this episode, David Pakman takes Dr. Phil to task for his right-leaning stances during a debate on cancel culture. Dr. Phil, known for his mega-popular TV talk show, has often claimed neutrality in politics, but his actions tell a different story. Recently, he made an appearance at a Donald Trump rally at Madison Square Garden, where he harshly criticized the Democratic Party's stance on cancel culture, dismissing it as mere bullying. But here's the kicker. Dr. Phil's arguments are mostly opinion-based and lack substantial evidence. This is where Pakman shines, meticulously deconstructing Dr. Phil's assertions and highlighting the absence of solid backing for his claims. So buckle up as we dive deep into how David Pakman skillfully lays bare Dr. Phil's positions in this intense debate.
We had one group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation.
Right.
This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time. Are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I understand,
crazy.
Because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. Because some of those people also did some really good things at the time. We don't need to endorse everything they did, but we need to acknowledge the good and the bad.
You know what else is bad? Not smashing that subscribe button. So if you're digging this content, please hit like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Now let's talk about Dr. Phil. He's been throwing around this idea that removing slave owners' names from places is like rewriting history. But here's the deal. It's not about erasing history. It's about who we decide to honor and celebrate. We all know slavery happened. That's not up for debate. What's wild is thinking we should keep honoring the folks who owned slaves. Like, we learn about Hitler in school, but Germany doesn't go naming schools after him, right? That's not forgetting history. It's choosing not to glorify a monster. Dr. Phil seems to think that if we pull down statues or change school names, suddenly we'll forget all our history. That's just ridiculous. Nobody's forgetting George Washington or Thomas Jefferson just because we don't see their names on some buildings. And really, keeping those names up? That sends a messed up message to Black students who have to walk into schools named after people who would have enslaved their ancestors. Changing a name to make a community feel more inclusive and respected, how is that anything but good?
When it comes to cancel culture, something you've also written and spoken about, what do you think is the prototypical or emblematic example of someone who was unfairly canceled over the last few years?
Well, I think the idea of cancel culture is more than one person, and I'm not going to speak specifically about one person. What I'm going to say is you've got people that want their speech instead of free speech. And so they will come in and talk about in a university certain things that can't be shared, can't be talked about. We've got universities that have put out language that they highly recommend their professors to not use. One of them that jumps out at me from the University of California is they were encouraged to no longer say America is the land of opportunity, or the job should go to the most qualified person. They were saying you can't say those things anymore because they are considered to be oppressive. And if you have university faculty, even tenured faculty, that talk about those things or ask their students to take positions that are contrary to what they believe, what the students believe, they get grieved against, they get suspended, they get disciplined, and in a sense canceled at that point.
You know, that's interesting. Let me weigh in on that a little bit, because that's very interesting. You know, in preparation for the interview, I looked at the academic setting, because a lot of times when we talk about cancellation, we talk about, oh, a comedian who said or did something, and then for a while they didn't have shows or something like that, you know, Louis C.K., for example, et cetera. I looked for the revocation of tenure for professors in a lot of these schools that you talk about or allude to. And really, it seems that when tenure is being stripped, it's for real wrongdoing. Plagiarism is uncovered, sexual harassment of students, et cetera. I really struggle to find evidence in a country of 330 million people of tenure being stripped just because of using the wrong language. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't wacky memos that go out, or I'm with you that this stuff exists anecdotally. But if we think about what is happening big picture, I actually struggle to really find examples of this as an epidemic. Tell me where I may be missing something.
Well, I don't know what you mean by epidemic.
Well, that it's happening, that professors are being stripped of tenure, not for serious violations of their you know, like I said, sexual harassment, plagiarism, being involved in criminality, but just because they said something that is maybe not politically correct. I'm just not seeing that tenure is being stripped from professors for that. Do you have any examples of professors that have lost tenure in that way?
I do, and I'll provide it to you. How's that? I'll get you a list and send it to you.
That would be, I would love to do that, because if that is happening, I want to expose that, and I want to talk about that.
It's pretty hilarious when Pakman presses Dr. Phil for actual examples of professors losing tenure just for saying something politically incorrect, and Dr. Phil can't name a single one. Instead, he promises to send Pakman a list later, which totally feels like a dodge since he's the one making the claim right there and then. Pakman is armed with the facts. When professors lose tenure, it's almost always for serious misconduct like plagiarism, sexual harassment, or criminal behavior, not merely for expressing a controversial opinion. Plus, let's remember that tenure is fundamentally designed to protect professors' freedom of speech. So the idea that universities are stripping it away over a controversial comment doesn't really hold up. And this whole narrative that students can't handle opposing views? That's pretty exaggerated. Surveys show that most college students are actually in favor of free speech and open debate. They just expect their professors to foster an environment where everyone feels respected. That's not cancel culture. That's basic decency. At the end of the day, there's no real evidence of a mass wave of professors being fired for speaking their minds. Cancel culture might grab headlines, but Pakman demonstrates that the actual impact is way smaller than folks like Dr. Phil make it out to be. That's it for today's video. If you've enjoyed it, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments section below.